Hello, I'm Ibrahim Imam, and welcome to this episode of the Neurology Lounge podcast, in which we will continue exploring encephalitis. In this episode, I'll be speaking to Michael D. Lemonick, author of the viral illness memoir titled The Perpetual Now. Michael retired in 2022 as the chief opinion editor at Scientific American magazine, where he had worked since 2015. And before that, he had spent 20 years as a writer at Time magazine, where he wrote more than 50 cover stories on science and the environment. That sounds to me like a record.
I think it may be still.
He has been a freelance contributor to Scientific American, New Scientist, Discover, National Geographic, Smithsonian, Wired, The New Yorker, and others too many to mention. He's also the author of 7 popular science books. Michael teaches writing and journalism at Princeton University and has also taught at NYU, Johns Hopkins, and the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, where he earned an MS degree in 1983. Michael Lemonick, welcome to the Neurology Lounge podcast, and thanks for sparing time for me.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Usual first question, why did you write the book? I'm not sure, it is scientific, but it's, I guess, a bit out of your usual topics, would I say?
Well, so when I was at Time magazine, I had to write about almost everything. My favorite topics are mostly astronomy, physics, climate change, but I had written at different times in my career about neuroscience as well. But what led me to writing this book was an encounter I had on the street with somebody I knew from years ago, from when we were in middle school together. And she recognized me, I recognized her, and she came up to me and said, she introduced herself. And I said, no, I know who you are. And in fact, as we were talking, my mind was drawing up images of her in middle school, dragging her cello into the orchestra room, vivid memories from back in the 1960s. So I knew who she was. And she asked me, have you heard what happened to my sister? I said, no, I didn't. I hadn't heard. And it turned out her sister had developed viral encephalitis, which had essentially made her profoundly amnesic. She lost the ability to recall specific incidents from her past. She knew some general facts about her past, but no specific incidents that she could describe. And more startling, she was also not able to form new memories. So as the sister explained to me, if you had a conversation with her and left the room and came right back, she would have no idea that she had ever seen you before. And as I was listening to this, I didn't say to myself, wow, how could there be such a thing? What I did instead was remember back to my first years in university. I took a introduction to psychology course, and I remember 2 or 3 things from that course for the entire year. And one of them was the story of a man named H.M., or called H.M. Those were his initials. His identity hadn't been revealed. And what I learned in 1971 was that this young man, he was then 27, had brain surgery to try and cure his very profound epilepsy. He couldn't function with the epilepsy, and they thought they had figured out what part of the brain the disrupted electrical signals were coming from. It was the hippocampus. It was an organ deep inside the brain. And they decided to remove it to see if they could cure his symptoms. And at the time, nobody really knew what the hippocampus was for. So they thought, well, this should be safe. And when he came out of the surgery, his epilepsy was indeed reduced. But the doctors and nurses quickly realized that he had developed profound amnesia, that he couldn't remember specific details from his past, and that he could not form new memories. And at the time, I was 18 years old, I was haunted by this story. It was, I can't imagine what that would be like. I can't imagine what it would be like to talk to that person. And I'd never forgot that story. And in a couple of stories for Time, I referred to him. We did actually a cover story on memory. And basically, whenever you talk about memory in a journalistic article, you have to talk about HM, because he was this. I should say, after his surgery, they realized, oh, that's what the hippocampus does, and and that began years of research by neurologists into what HM's specific deficits were. They probed what he was able to do, what he wasn't able. He basically became the face of the modern study of memory. People suddenly realized this is where we need to focus. And so when I wrote my stories for Time, I mentioned him, and then I talked about what we've learned since then. And as this woman from my past was talking to me, I realized it's another case of HM. It's exactly the same thing, and more important. This old friend, wanted me to write about it. She knew I was a science journalist. She wanted me to write about her sister because she wanted to popularize the idea that the mind is, or the brain is, a sophisticated organ, and we don't know how it works. And these are some things, anyway, to make people more aware of the brain and how it can go wrong. Okay. And so I thought, well, that would be very interesting. But as a journalist, we have kind of a rule. If something major happens for the first time, that's a big deal. It was discovered in the 50s that the structure of DNA is helical. It's like a helix, a double helix. That was amazing news at the time. But if somebody else had confirmed that discovery, I'm sure they probably did, it would have been, well, yeah, okay, but we know this already. Yeah. Science doesn't say that, but ordinary people do. But in thinking about how I would write about this woman, this sister, I thought, well, but how can I make it compelling? Because it's the second example. Actually, it's not the second example, but I thought it was the second example of this kind of memory loss. So what do you say? Well, here's another one. Now I'm going to tell you all about her. And that, journalistically, for a lay audience, that's not good enough. But we got together, the sister who had approached me, we got together and talked about it more. And I began to realize that while she was not the first example of this kind of amnesia, she was quite different from almost anybody else who had been documented in the literature. And she was different in that HM had terrible epilepsy. It took him 6 years to graduate high school, and he couldn't really do any kind of sophisticated job or have any sophisticated hobbies. So he worked at an assembly line, wrapping copper wires around the core of an electric motor, because that was pretty much all he could do. The understanding that the hippocampus was crucial to memory formation and recall. There weren't that many things they could ask him about, and they asked him, of course, about his past. What did you used to do as a kid? And he said, well, my parents would take me on drives on something called the Mohawk Trail in Massachusetts. So he had a general memory of a kind of incident. But when they probe more deeply, they say, oh, well, tell us something that happened on one of those trips. He couldn't do it. He couldn't do it. So he knew the fact that he had done it, but he couldn't he couldn't put himself into that situation and remember what they had done. So anyway, and what I learned about my subject, Lonnie Sue Johnson, was that she was, first of all, much older. She was in her 60s when she developed encephalitis, and she had had a very rich and full life involving mastering many skills, and she worked. She was an inveterate lover of wordplay, so she had a very sophisticated vocabulary, and the scientists who heard about her realized she could teach us, go more deeply into how memory works and what kinds of memory are retained in a situation like this, and so on. So they began testing her and putting her under the MRI, and they thought it was a very important new case because it could tell us more than we had been able to find out from HM. And I thought that is the excuse for a book. Yes, we had HM, very important, but this patient could expand greatly on what we've learned from him and other amnesia victims. So that's how I decided.
And I'm assuming you wrote the book in the same way you would have written your other books, research, put the pieces together.
Yes. Interviews with people, with the scientists who were now studying her, with her family, with her friends from long ago, from her friends that she was spending time with when the epilepsy, when the hippocampal damage was done. So it was a different set of friends who knew her in a different context. And I tried to, if you're writing a book about a person,
Yes.
normally you would interview the person. I couldn't really do that, although I did have one interview with her.
Yes.
And so I had to get a picture of her from talking to all the people who were in her orbit. So I had to gather all that information. But I also had to talk about, or I felt that I had to talk about the history of our understanding of memory, because if she is going to help us take a leap forward in our understanding, well, how did we get to where we are now? And when did people start thinking about where in the brain memory was located? And that turned to go back into the late 1800s and probably before. So I had to do that research. I had to find people who had written scientific papers about Lonnie Sue, and I found them and talked to some of them. I was able to talk to the neuroscientist who studied HM from the late 1950s or early 60s all the way up through the mid 2000s.
Okay.
The mid 2000s, yeah. And so I interviewed her, and she had obviously enormous insights into his case and also into what questions remain to be answered.
Okay. So some of the questions I'm going to ask you later are not going to be unfair in some of the scientific questions.
Okay.
But talking about Lonnie Sue herself,
Yeah.
you did say she was quite an accomplished violinist, a pilot, an artist. What was she like before the encephalitis as a person?
Well, I should tell you that she and I were in high school together, but I never met her. It was a big high school.
Okay.
So, she was a driven person. First of all, she would take on these projects that were extremely challenging, and she would just bore in and do whatever she needed to do to get them solved. So when she moved to upstate New York, she wanted to have a place where she could land her plane because she had her own plane, but there wasn't anything available. So she got a bulldozer and she bulldozed a landing strip next to her farmhouse. That sort of crazy thing. She was also an extremely busy a commercial illustrator. She worked tirelessly on drawings for the New Yorker, cover of the New Yorker magazine, and for the New York Times, and for companies who were designing packaging. And she was just always, always, always working around the clock. But I also learned from people who knew her at different stages of life that she had a terrific sense of humor. She could be quiet, but she could also be extremely engaging. People really were drawn to her, I guess. And she was deeply loved by a lot of people.
So clearly a lot of things for the scientists to prove
By
based
the
on.
way, she had been married for 10 years.
Okay.
She has no memory of that. She's surprised to hear that she was married.
Okay.
So anyway.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to ask you a question I was going to ask later, which probably come back to her illness, was that when she came round, she could recognize her mother and sister, but nobody else.
Right.
Was
Right.
that? Yeah.
So the my understanding that I got from the neuroscientists and neurologists who worked with her is that things as deeply entrenched as your knowledge of your family is actually something that does remain at some level in people with this. And I also should say the damage to the memory and to the hippocampus are not identical from one case to another. So the symptoms are not always exactly the same. But in her case, her mother and her sister were a part of her, and that sort of explains why she was able to recognize them. But yeah, very few other people.
I suppose that kind of memory is probably more widely distributed in the brain.
Probably so. That's right.
Okay. Can you explain her illness a bit? I know it started with what seemed like a flu, but then took a sinister turn.
Right. So nobody knows exactly what came on because she lived by herself in a farmhouse, as I say, in upstate New York. A few weeks before her attack, it was in the, I think, late fall or very early winter. So the weather was miserable outside. At one point, the chimney on her wood stove blew over in a blizzard. And, the house was filling with smoke. So she climbed onto the roof and fixed it.
She would do it herself.
Yeah. But a day or two later, she talked to her mother on the phone, and she sounded a little distracted, and she complained of a headache. But these are things that everybody gets sometimes, and especially if you've been on the roof in a blizzard. Flu-like or bad cold-like symptoms, and that's all anybody knows until several days later, when her neighbor and her business partner, came over for some reason, and the door was locked, and he looked in the window, and she was in the kitchen, and she was picking up objects like a jar and looking at them. So, what is this thing? And he could tell that there was something very wrong, and he broke in, and she didn't make any sense, and she had a fever, and he called the ambulance, or he called an ambulance, and they came in the blizzard, because it's always snowing up there, and took her to the hospital.
And well, I suppose she followed the severe course based on her memory damage. She received treatment with acyclovir, which you said
Right.
killed the virus. But by the time she had it, it had destroyed billions and billions of her brain cells.
Right.
One of the unfair questions for you,
Yeah.
what are the prospects for repairing the damage caused by HSV1? I mean, acyclovir doesn't do that.
Right. Well, I think there is no um, there's no thought of how we might do that at this point. There are. I was taught when I was at university that uh, you can never grow new brain cells, and then we learned a few decades later that actually, yes, you can, and your brain can rewire itself. But when the damage is this profound, um, the the brain, as far as we know, cannot assist itself in repairing itself.
And even if it did, I suppose it wouldn't bring back those memories that had gone.
Well, that's an interesting question because one way of thinking of the hippocampus is as a kind of a way station where inputs come in, you see things, you hear things, you have an experience and you sense it in all different ways, and those go through different processing centers in your brain, and or they're distributed to those processing centers, but the hippocampus can then tie a little bow around them,
Okay.
and that helps you to retrieve a memory. You remember that when I smelled this smell, I remember seeing the flowers, I remember somebody talking about the flowers. It all sort of comes back, but it comes back from different parts of the brain. And if those are still intact, I can't say we would never be able to retrieve them again.
Okay, that's interesting and hopeful as well.
Yes, but I'm no expert, so
Yeah, but that sounds at least it's some hope rather than
yeah,
it,
yeah.
even if it's far off. Um, Her recovery, you described it, very slow and limited. She regained her ability to walk, talk, and feed herself, but you said she couldn't turn new experiences into lasting memories.
Right.
And this is what the perpetual now is, I presume. That's state.
Yes, right. So she can't remember the past mostly. She uh, can't project into the future by learning new things. So she's stuck in this. It's always today, and there is no tomorrow, and there is no yesterday. HM, one of the questions they asked him at some point early on, they said, so what will you do tomorrow? And he would always respond something like, whatever is appropriate,
Hmm,
essentially masking the fact that he had no idea,
okay.
but understanding that he should give an answer. So it was actually rather brilliant answer.
Okay. And even though she could function in the now,
Yes,
you said because she could access the mental maps that tie perception to action and concepts to words.
right.
Explore that a bit, how that works.
Well, so one of the things that they learned from HM is that uh, he could form new memories and access old. Well, just the fact that she could walk and talk means that those abilities had not been wiped out, and and we learned through HM that there are at least a couple of different kinds of memory, and one kind is explicit memory, things you can describe with words, but there are also implicit memories, what some people talk about as muscle memory, and the most famous example probably is the fact that even if you haven't ridden a bicycle for 30 years, you can get on and ride because your body has a memory of what to do. And that sort of memory is not disturbed by this encephalitis because it doesn't go through the hippocampus. So that explains why you can walk and talk in this situation because that's muscle memory. Why she could still play the viola, which is also muscle memory, and why when she was enough recovered, she could start drawing again. So she remembered how to draw. She remembered how to prepare a drawing. These were all physical acts that were still very familiar to her.
Procedural memory. It has so
Right.
many names, I presume. What was life for her and her family in that situation? I mean, she was discharged eventually, had some rehab, went back home.
Oh, well, so she was discharged, but not to home. She had to go to a nursing home because she could not take care of herself.
Okay.
And she moved from one nursing home to another in New York State as she got better. So she was able to learn to walk again. She could talk. She could start to feed herself. Then they would move her to a more advanced place where there was uh, more therapy, occupational therapy, and so on. And so she has never, even to this day, gone back to her family home
Oh, okay. So all this,
because
okay,
even now she has to live in an assisted living facility.
okay. But clearly, her mother and daughter were very, very involved. Um, and you said they were the ones that were convinced that she could get better and pushed her.
Yes.
How did they do that? What?
Well, by constant reinforcement. They were with her all the time, much more, even when she was in the nursing home, they were with her more than any nurse, more than any doctor. And they would continually press her to try to do something. I remember once her mother at one point handed her a pencil so she might start drawing again, and she didn't even know what to do. And so the mother took the pencil and forced her hand so it touched the paper, and then she moved the hand so that Lonnie Sue could see the line that came out. And it really was just a complete focus on her recovery by both her mother and her sister. And I think that's the case for almost anybody. If you go to the hospital for a knee replacement, you might be in a rehabilitation facility for a while, but then finally they discharge you. And if you don't have anyone to push you, come on, let's try walking, let's try getting up. Um, you don't get better, or you don't get better very fast. And so it was, and the doctors agree that without their intervention and their constant pushing Lonnie Sue,
Yes.
they she might not have gotten nearly as much better as she has.
Okay. Um, and one of the early things that came up was her ability to create and complete puzzles. Is this something she was interested in before, or is this something that just came out of the blues?
There were a few stages, uh, and at one point, maybe a year after her encephalitis, she could not stop writing. She would write. She was driven to just write and write and write and write. People were very worried because it was she wouldn't go to sleep. Then one day, her mother ran into somebody on the street who had known Lonnie Sue as a child and who still lived in the area. And the mother told this woman about Lonnie Sue's condition and about how she keeps can't stop writing. And this woman who creates puzzles, not crossword puzzles, but other kinds of word puzzles, said, "Well, I have these books where there's a square of what look like random letters, but embedded in the letters are words. And you find the word and you draw a circle around it, and you find the word." And she said, maybe Lonnie Sue will like these. And the mother took them home and gave them to Lonnie Sue. And within, I think, a day, she had finished all of them. And she said, "Can you please go get me some more, or maybe I'll just erase these completely and start again." And her mother was going to get her more, but couldn't do so for a day or two. And so Lonnie Sue, who so much wanted to do these word puzzles, started creating her own. And at first they were grids of letters that had words in them. I mean, grids of letters that had words embedded. But then, be, on her own, she began illustrating these puzzles. So I don't know if if you have the book or if I have the book handy. Yeah, that sort of, there it is. She started with just letters,
Hmm.
and then she started adding illustrations, and those that you're looking at were originally in color, but they couldn't reproduce that in a paperback.
And then her drawings as well, isn't
And
it?
her drawings, well, so the one at the bottom left of my screen
Yes.
with cats in it
Yes.
was another experiment that her mother tried, where the mother drew one line, just one line, and she said, "Okay, Lonnie Sue, you draw a line, and then we'll alternate, and eventually we'll have a picture." And this is the picture that came out. And in the original, the lines by the mother are in blue, and the lines by Lonnie Sue are in red, so you can see how that progressed. But the letter puzzles became more and more and more elaborate, and more vividly illustrated in a style not unlike the style she had had before the illness. So this is already something you could never have tested with HM. Uh,
Yeah.
is creativity preserved? Well, he was never creative about anything, but in her, looks like clearly it was, but it took a different form than what it had before. So
Mhm.
that's one of quite a few things that they've learned so far, and they're still looking at her case.
And I mean, her creativity became so brilliant that she had an exhibition. I understand she had an exhibition of her work.
Yes. So what happened was that the sister Aline Johnson and the mother Maggie Johnson arranged with a local museum because she was a local person, to have a show of her work both before and after
Okay.
the encephalitis, so people could see what had changed and what had remained the same.
Hmm.
And that's really that's where we had the conversation that convinced me to write the book. And seeing those comparisons made me even more determined to do so.
Interesting. Um, and she's still there helping. We'll get to the neuroscience contribution. But just before we get there, the a bit of the virus and the brain. And you
Yes.
described, vividly how this HSV1, which is the most common cause of viral encephalitis,
Hmm.
gets into the brain through the nose. Um, Describe that a bit more. And is that unique? Maybe another unfair question. Is that unique for the HSV1?
Oh well, so I'm not there. So there are other viruses that cause encephalitis. So it is not unique.
Is the
Uh,
entry through the nose? Is that
oh, that well, it's through the nerves in the nose is a typical route. So what I was told, and I'm not a virologist, is that the the virus is present in most of us. It's very common, and most of us have the virus in our bodies, and it doesn't cause us any particular harm. Uh, I think it's another HSV virus that causes cold sores, maybe the same one.
because,
But again,
yeah,
annoying, but not that big a deal. And for reasons nobody understands, it might have to do with a weakened immune system, which could have been caused by climbing up on the roof in the freezing cold for hours, for example. When your immune system gets weaker, the virus awakens and sometimes travels up to the brain, but nobody really knows why.
and as you said, a lot of viruses do cause encephalitis, but HSV1 is particularly aggressive, isn't it?
Well, yes, and especially in going preferentially to the hippocampus. And again, nobody knows exactly why it does that, but it tends to go straight for the hippocampus and start destroying cells. And that's not what happened to HM. His hippocampus was surgically removed, but there was a British musician who also had viral encephalitis and had the same condition. Clive Waring was his name. And you might wonder if her musical ability was a part of why she was such an interesting subject. Why didn't they study Clive Waring? And the answer is that for whatever reason, the personality of an encephalitis victim can be very different. And he was basically frightened all the time because he didn't recognize things, and he could still play the piano, and he could still lead a chorus, but he was just so frightened at being in this state where he couldn't remember anything that he couldn't calm down enough to be studied.
So he was even less in the now, I presume.
Yes, he was right. Or he was in the scary part of the now.
Scary. Okay, yeah. Okay. Yes, I was going to talk about Clive Waring, but you've answered the question already as to why he did worse off than Lonnie.
Yeah, and it might well be that he had a very high-strung personality beforehand, and he was a little bit neurotic, and it may be that was amplified somehow when this happened, but nobody really knows.
Well, thankfully, there are not too many cases to study. Otherwise, probably, we could get more information, but then it's such a horrible state to be.
Right.
Okay.
In fact, I should say one of the scientists studying Lonnie Sue went to a conference and presented some results from MRI studies.
Okay.
And her colleagues said, "Wait a minute, but this woman has profound amnesia from encephalitis. How could you possibly make her sit still enough? She actually let you put her in an MRI?" And the answer is yes, and that's evidently unusual. And I have actually observed an MRI study with her, and when she's in the machine, they have to tell her to sit still because she sort of hums tunes and starts dancing lying on her back, and they have to tell her to be still. So she's very happy most of the time.
Which is a good thing in that state of mind.
Absolutely.
So you talked about how her case contributed to the emerging view of the role of the hippocampus in memory. In other words, HM gave us one view, but it looks like it was probably not as dichotomous as we now understand it. How did she contribute to this new view? And what exactly is this new view of the hippocampus?
So when I took that course in 1971, that was what they told me, I think. The procedural memory is separate, and those, they're just two different things. But in talking to one of the scientists, Barbara Landau, she said, well, if you think about it, yes, there's a distinction between procedural and declarative memory, but think about it. When you learn to ride a bicycle,
yes,
you had to think explicitly about what you're doing. You have to push this pedal, and you have to do that, and you have to, and you have to practice over and over before you get good at it. So at a certain point, it stops being a conscious memory of what you have to do to being a muscle memory.
Okay.
So it's more that these things are on a spectrum, and the spectrum, where they are on the spectrum, changes as you go along. Another example, HM knew that Paris is the capital of France. And that's just a general semantic memory. It's knowledge of the world that we kind of absorb, and we absorb unconsciously.
Yes.
But at one point, he had heard the first time that Paris is the capital of France. So at that point, it was an explicit memory, and it moved into that muscle memory area at some rate or other.
You can argue it's common sense, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, it is, but But nobody had talked much about that until pretty recently.
Yeah, it's interesting that sometimes the paradigms we establish kind of limit our thinking until somebody comes to break it.
Yes, yes, exactly.
Okay. I want to talk about highly superior autobiographical memory, which is
Ah, yes.
kind of the opposite of what happened. And you gave a case of Jill Price. Since she was 11, she could remember everything she'd done.
Every day and so on. And the thought is that first of all, some people simply do have much better memories than others, just typical people. I can remember vividly instances of things that happened to me when I was 3 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old, and others that I can't remember at all.
I can't.
So I have a good memory. Although as I get older, the short-term memory is not as good. Uh, but it's also evidently the case that she would often write down in a diary what had happened to her on a given day, and she did it for years and years. And writing it down and seeing it through your eyes rather than hearing it through your ears may cement memories in place even more strongly. And in fact, I have a strange example of this. A friend of mine were in Germany in 1973, and we went into East Berlin, which was still separate from West Berlin, and we stopped on the street and sat down on a bench, and there was a television tower looming above us. And I said to myself, I'm going to focus on this moment because I want to remember it for the rest of my life. And sure enough, I do. And it may be a phenomenon like that where her having written something down and kind of focused on it
Yes.
helped her to draw it up later. But most of us could not accomplish that even by writing things down.
And you could argue that it's a burden to have to remember every little
Well,
deep.
right. So yeah, it's and in fact, science fiction stories sometimes address that. But I think it was not a burden for her because they wouldn't come into her mind unless she retrieved them.
Okay, okay. And there wasn't a trade-off. Sometimes when you're so good in one thing, you kind of struggle with something else.
Right.
Okay. I mean, it's difficult to get away from talking about memory when it comes to viral encephalitis. But I have to touch on Eric Kandel, Nobel
Ah,
Prize.
yes.
Um, uh, what, how did he revolutionize our understanding of how memory forms?
Well, he at first he was interested in other areas of neuroscience, but he read about the case of HM, and he became very interested in what a memory actually is physically. And to simplify it as much as possible, he started working with a giant sea slug, I believe it is, and because it has an incredibly simple nervous system. I mean, I can't remember how simple, but and he could condition this sea slug to respond in different ways to different mild electrical stimuli. And what he learned was that when he uh, when he connected the stimulus to a response and did it very often, it would tend to be fixed in that nerve. What that response was. In a way, the response to the stimulus became the path of least resistance for the nervous system. There was like this road has been traveled before many times, and so it's easy for me to travel it, says the electric impulse. And when he had fewer, when he had habituated the slug to certain behaviors with fewer trials, it was less firmly established. And so what he realized is that repetition of a particular connection between two nerves or between between two nerves tends to make that connection stronger. And so when these two or more nerves are fire together because they're used to have done it before, that is what constitutes a memory.
Yeah, I think it had a giant axon which helped.
That's what it was. That's what it was.
Okay. Well, some of the questions were not fair, but you've really enlightened me on many of them. Coming back to your book, you did mention some of the lessons. What key lessons do you want readers, or did you want readers to take from the book yourself?
Well, so the big lesson, well, as you know, I had always been intrigued with what HM was really like, and what, as best I could understand it, what drove him and what his essence was, and now I had the chance with Lonnie Sue, and before I wrote the book, I had to write a book proposal, and the book proposal, you put on a tentative title for the book, and the tentative title was "The Woman Who Lost Herself,"
Okay.
and the reason for that was that it seemed to me, again, my memories are really vivid and important to me, and they keep me in touch with who I am and how I became who I am and all that, my history.
Yes.
And she has no personal history. Uh, so I figured, well, herself, that thing we call the self, had vanished.
Mm.
It must have been. This is before I started meeting with her.
Yes.
And by the end of the book, it was clear to me that the essence that she showed to people before the encephalitis, the essence of her personality, not her knowledge particularly, but her personality, was very much the same as what people had described. And yet she'd had this profound brain injury. And what I realized was that I had to change the title. She had not lost herself. Everybody who meets her now, who knew her before, says she's essentially the same person who just happens to have a terrible memory. And so that was the lesson I learned, that there's something more fundamental to who you are than your explicit memories.
That's gratifying to know.
Yeah,
Yeah, there was a philosophical theme. You explored that issue of who we are, if
right, right.
yeah. Okay. And clearly a lot of information about the history and about encephalitis of the virus and about memory. So quite a few lessons.
And also about how memory testing works um, in situations like this.
Mm.
And they had to come up with new tests that because they were testing aspects of memory nobody ever had before. And so how a scientist tackles a question like this was also something that I learned.
And I mean, compared to patient HM, we didn't have, well, they didn't have the sophisticated imaging technology in his
That's
time.
right. That's right. They imaged his brain after he died, but that could only do so much.
Yeah. Um, okay. What do you think are the major questions that remain in the field, either of memory or viral encephalitis?
Well, so as for the virus, that was not something I focused on a great deal. So I don't really um, have anything to contribute about that.
Okay.
Um, but about memory, what do we still need to know? Well, I mean, I guess what the precise distinction is between an implicit and an explicit memory. Why semantic memory is preserved when autobiographic memory is not. I don't think we know that exactly
A lot to keep the neuroscientists busy for a long time.
for a long, long time.
Okay. Do you want to give us a taste of what the other books you've written? I know you talked about seven other ones you've written. And
Yes, so I have written 7 books total. Uh, one, two, three, four were about 5 were about astronomy.
okay, okay.
One was about climate change, and then this one about neuroscience, about memory.
Okay. And for a lay doctor like me, which one would you recommend for astronomy? Which one would I be kind of a primer?
Well, well, the one I think is most readable and fun is a short biography of William Herschel, who's the man who discovered the planet Uranus.
Okay, okay.
And when an editor came to me and asked if I'd like to write this book, and my reaction was, well, he discovered a planet. Okay, that's one chapter. What's the rest of the book about? And the guy said, just go away and do some research and think about whether it's more interesting than you think. And it turned out to be much more interesting. Herschel was trained as a musician. He was a professional musician, took up astronomy at the age of 40, was unsatisfied with the quality of telescopes, so he made his own telescopes that were better than anything anybody else had made. He was an extraordinary person, and he actually, in some ways, created modern cosmology, the study of the universe, by realizing it's not individual objects that are important; it's the average behavior of a big class of objects. So individual stars are interesting, but if you want to know how the whole life cycle of a star and understand how they relate to each other, you have to take millions of observations and statistically analyze them. And nobody had ever done that before.
Interesting. Well, I'll probably have a look at that as well.
Okay.
And are you writing any book or involved?
No, not yet, but I'm thinking of a book on color perception. I'm colorblind, and I've always seen colors differently from most people, and I'm fascinated by that difference and what it would be to experience normal color vision, and whether I'm handicapped by it or whether I'm not. It's just there's a lot more about how we see color than most people think about.
Okay. Kind of part of the neurodiversity of the brain.
Right, exactly.
Okay. Well, when you've written it, do let me know. I would like to
I
have
will, of course.
and maybe bring you back to talk about it. Okay. I know you've given us a lot to chew. Michael Lemonick, thank you very much for participating in this episode of the Neurology Lounge podcast. I'm most grateful. And to my audience, either listening or watching, thank you very much. And if you enjoyed it, click on the like button, subscribe to any of the channels so that you don't miss future episodes. And whilst waiting for the future episodes, you might want to check my lesser profile book called Surfing the Brain. And I have a neurology database called Neuro Checklist. But until then, thank you very much, Michael. I really enjoyed the conversation.
And so did I. Thank you.